So let's dive right in. What does responsive mean? What's a responsive app or a responsive layout? Responsiveness in UI design and UI development is all about handling different sizes. For example, for your app, you of course might most commonly have portrait mode users or devices so that users use your app on a phone, on a smartphone, which is in portrait mode. But obviously, users can also rotate that device and view your app in landscape mode. And maybe you want to adjust your app there a little bit to look better in landscape mode and be better usable there. And in addition, people might not just use your app on phones, but also on bigger phones or on tablets or on a desktop PC. Wherever Android or iOS or whichever platform you're building for runs, you might want to support that and don't show the same layout on all different device sizes. And therefore, in this module, I'll introduce you to the general tools that enable you to build for these different device sizes. So that's responsive, but what's adaptive? Adaptive is actually a term I came up with, or you read it from time to time, but it's not an official term. But it typically, if you read it, is related to adapting your user interface to different operating systems your app runs on. And that, of course, means you want to have a certain look on Android and you want to have a certain, probably different look and feel on iOS. Still, of course, we want to use one and the same project and one and the same code base. And therefore, as you will learn in this module, Flutter also gives you tools to adjust the look of your app or the behavior of your app depending on the platform. For Android, you of course typically want that material design look and the material design styles, which you have in Flutter apps out of the box, by the way. So Android is the default operating system Flutter targets, probably because Flutter is developed by a Google team. You of course also want to have the typical Android animations when you're switching between different screens, for example. Now, right now, we're not really switching between screens, and we'll do that in a later course module, but nonetheless, that will also be a part of adapting your design. And you might also want to use certain Android-specific fonts if you're not bringing your own fonts, as we are actually doing it. And on iOS, unsurprisingly, you want to have that iOS or Cupertino look in your app. Cupertino because Apple sits in Cupertino, and therefore this iOS look, the iOS design language, is often also referred to as Cupertino design or Cupertino styling. You obviously also want to have typical iOS animations when you're switching between pages. And by the way, it's not just about animations, it's also tiny details. For example, on iOS apps, you can swipe with your finger to go back and forth between different pages in your app. On Android, that's typically not supported. You could bring either user experience to the other platform. You could add swiping to Android, and you can get rid of it on iOS, but typically you want to preserve that default behavior users of the platform are used to make your app feel familiar to them. And last but not least, of course, you also might want to use specific fonts, the iOS fonts, on the different platforms. And that would also be something we can refer to as adaptive. So that is what responsive and adaptive means. And of course, our overall goal in Flutter is that we still only use one code base, one project. We don't want to start building totally different apps just for the different platforms, because then we would be almost at the same point we are if we just use the native programming languages for the platforms. Obviously, you would still have the advantage of using only one programming language, but if you have to manage different projects, of course, it means that whenever you add a certain new feature, even if it doesn't directly impact the user interface, let's say you change the ordering logic for the transactions users can add, then you have to do that in two different code bases in two different projects, and that's typically something you would want to avoid. So we absolutely want to stick in that one code base. And therefore, we also will have one widget tree, because Flutter is all about that widget tree. And if you remember the previous sections, then you had one widget at the top, and then all the other widgets are kind of nested inside of that widget by passing widgets into arguments of other widgets. And we want to keep that idea, we want to keep that structure. And indeed, in a Flutter app, you can only have one root widget. You can't have two entry points in your app, for example. Now, with all these restrictions or all these goals, The only way for us to make our app responsive and or adaptive is that we detect which platform we're running on or which device size we have available in our code, in our widget tree, and then we render certain subtrees, certain individual widgets based on the platform or on the device size we have. And therefore we have one widget tree, but in certain points of that tree, we have an either or decision where we render differently styled widgets or totally different widgets based on the size or on the platform. And that is what I will now show you throughout this module at different examples, where we will go back to our application here and start working on it so that we have a different look on iOS and also a different behavior based on the device size.